Welcome to Case Solved Archives. The following documentary is reconstructed from official police reports, witness statements, forensic logs, search grid coordinates, and public court records. While the core facts, timelines, and investigative breakthroughs are presented exactly as documented, specific names, minor locations, and identifying details have been fictionalized to respect the privacy of the victims and their families. This is not a story of a single vanishing. It is the story of an entire generation's innocence being erased in a single night. In the spring of 1994, Oakhaven, Ohio, was a town that felt insulated from the chaotic headlines of the outside world. Nestled in the Appalachian foothills in the southeastern pocket of the state, it was a community built around a declining steel mill, surrounded by thousands of acres of dense, rolling state forests and limestone quarries. It was a place where generations attended the same high school, where families shared property lines for decades, and where the concept of violent crime was something that happened in distant cities. May 14, 1994, was a Saturday. For the senior class of Oakhaven High School, it was prom night, a rite of passage marking the threshold between childhood and the impending realities of adulthood. Among the attendees was a tight-knit group of 6 friends, practically inseparable since middle school. They were 18-year-old Mark Davies, his girlfriend Sarah Linley, 18-year-old David Vance, his date Chloe Aries, 17, and their best friends, Kevin O'Connor, 18, and Jessica Miller, 18. The 6 teenagers represented a cross-section of Oakhaven's brightest prospects. Mark was an aspiring mechanic, Sarah was a hospital volunteer bound for nursing school, David and Kevin were co-captains of the varsity baseball team, Chloe was the yearbook editor, and Jessica was a quiet, fiercely intelligent girl scheduled to begin an architecture program in the fall. They were grounded, responsible, and deeply loved by their respective families. Interviews with teachers, employers, and relatives confirmed there was no drug use, no severe interpersonal drama, and absolutely no desire to run away. To celebrate the evening together, Mark's father had allowed him to borrow the family's 1985 Ford Econoline conversion van, a massive, metallic blue vehicle outfitted with bench seats and a customized stereo system. It was the perfect vehicle for a group of 6 to travel in comfort. The timeline of May 14th is firmly established by a trail of photographs, receipts, and dozens of witness statements. At 5:30 p.m., the group converged at the Linley residence for photographs. The mood was exuberant. Sarah wore a dark blue dress. Chloe was in emerald green, Jessica in pale yellow. The boys wore standard rented tuxedos. At 6:45 p.m., they loaded into the Ford van, with Mark in the driver's seat, and departed. They arrived at the prom, held at a rented banquet hall on the north side of town, at approximately 7:15 p.m. Dozens of classmates and faculty chaperones confirmed their presence. The group danced, took formal portraits, and participated in the standard activities of the evening. They were described as sober, joyful, and completely at ease. The dance concluded at 11:30 p.m. Following the event, the 6 friends drove to the Starlight Diner, a 24-hour establishment situated on the county line, a popular post-prom destination. The diner's cash register receipt, later logged into evidence, shows David Vance paid for a large order of milkshakes and fries at 1:12 a.m. on Sunday, May 15th. The waitress who served them stated they were laughing, polite, and did not appear to be under any duress or followed by anyone in the establishment. At approximately 1:30 a.m., the group walked out into the cool, damp Ohio night. They entered the blue Ford van. According to statements from other classmates in the parking lot, Mark had mentioned taking a detour to Miller's Bluff, a scenic, elevated overlook roughly 5 miles up County Road 9, to watch the stars before heading home to beat their 2:30 a.m. curfews. The van's taillights faded down the 2-lane highway. It was the last confirmed sighting of the Oakhaven 6. Sunday morning broke with a creeping, suffocating panic. By 7 a.m., 6 different households woke to find empty beds and untouched bedrooms. In 1994, there were no smartphones to track, no GPS locations to ping. Parents began calling one another, the initial annoyance of broken curfews rapidly deteriorating into sheer terror. By 10 a.m., the Oakhaven Police Department was inundated with 6 simultaneous missing persons reports. Given the number of teenagers involved, law enforcement bypassed the standard 24-hour waiting period for runaways. You do not have a six-person, spontaneous runaway event involving high school seniors a week before graduation without taking their clothes or cashing their paychecks. A countywide be on the lookout, BOLO, alert was issued for the blue 1985 Ford Econoline van. For the first 48 hours, the investigation was a frantic waiting game. State patrol cruisers scoured the ditches along County Road 9, anticipating a horrific traffic accident. But there were no skid marks, no broken glass. The first major break, and the beginning of a profoundly dark mystery, occurred on Tuesday, May 17th. At 6:15 a.m., a logging truck driver navigating the treacherous, unpaved switchbacks of Blackwood Ridge, a dense, heavily wooded area completely in the opposite direction of Miller's Bluff, spotted something metallic glinting through the thick pine canopy. It was the blue Ford van. Crime scene investigators were dispatched immediately. The scene they encountered was baffling, establishing a narrative that defied logic. The van was parked haphazardly, half on the gravel shoulder, half in the deep brush. But it was not a crash. The vehicle was intact. However, the driver's side door and the rear passenger doors were wide open, exposing the interior to the elements. The keys were missing from the ignition. The battery was completely dead, but the headlight switch was pulled to the ON position, and the radio dial was turned up. A forensic team processed the interior. There was no blood. There were no signs of a physical struggle. No torn upholstery, no bullet holes, no shattered glass. On the bench seats, investigators found Sarah's corsage, Chloe's high heels, and 3 rented tuxedo jackets. Half-consumed sodas sat in the cup holders. It looked as though the 6 teenagers had simply evaporated into the Ohio air. But as technicians dug deeper, 2 chilling pieces of evidence emerged. First, tucked under the passenger seat, they found a disposable Kodak camera belonging to Jessica. The logistical nightmare of searching for 6 people cannot be overstated. The ridge spanned thousands of acres of dense forestry, intersecting with dangerous, water-filled limestone quarries, abandoned mining shafts, and subterranean caves. Over the course of a month, more than 500 volunteers, off-duty officers, and National Guard personnel walked grid patterns through the woods. Dive teams plunged into the murky depths of the local quarries. K-9 units trained in cadaver detection scoured the logging roads. Aerial helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the canopy at night. The search yielded absolutely nothing. Not a shred of clothing. Not a piece of jewelry. Not a single trace of 6 human beings. Investigators simultaneously worked the investigative angles. They brought in every owner of a heavy-duty utility truck or tow truck in the Tri-County area. They interviewed registered offenders, local poachers, and eccentric hermits living off the grid in the Appalachian foothills. They looked deeply into a potential red herring, a group of older boys from a rival high school who had engaged in a physical altercation with David and Kevin at a local gas station 3 days before the prom. The boys were brought in, interrogated for hours, and subjected to polygraph examinations. They all passed. Their alibis were ironclad. They had nothing to do with it. Every case you hear on this channel isn't just a story. It represents weeks of research, cross-checking facts, and piecing together fragments of real lives that were lost. We do this because these stories matter, and because somewhere out there, someone deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, then please take a second to subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments what part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support isn't just a number, it's the reason we keep going. Now, let's get back to the case. As the summer of 1994 faded into autumn, the momentum of the investigation hit a wall. You cannot arrest a suspect without evidence, and you cannot have a murder trial without bodies. The impact on Oakhaven was a slow, psychological strangulation. The community fundamentally changed. Doors that had been left unlocked for decades were suddenly bolted. Teenagers were subjected to strict, suffocating curfews. The town viewed outsiders with deep, paranoid suspicion. For the families of the 6 victims, life became a waking nightmare of ambiguous loss. This is a specific type of psychological trauma where there is no closure, no grave to visit, and no narrative to explain the absence. Bedrooms were preserved like museums, frozen in 1994. Dust settled on high school letterman jackets and unread college acceptance letters. Parents aged prematurely, their eyes constantly scanning crowds, diners, and passing cars, tortured by the microscopic, impossible hope that their children might walk through the door. Years turned into decades. The physical evidence collected from the van, the camera, the clothing, the steering wheel, was placed in long-term evidence storage. During this cold period, forensic science underwent a massive evolution. In 2005, the Oakhaven Cold Case Unit submitted the steering wheel of the Ford van for touch DNA analysis, hoping the person who intercepted the teens had driven the van to its final resting place. But the science was thwarted by the conditions of 1994. The van doors had been left wide open, exposing the interior to rain, humidity, and environmental degradation. The DNA was too fragmented to yield a profile. In 2012, an FBI task force reviewed the blurry photograph of the high beams, utilizing advanced digital clarifying software. They were able to determine that the vehicle blocking the road was likely a late 1980s model Ford F-350 utility truck, outfitted with a custom, heavy-duty brush guard. But without a license plate, it was merely a needle in a haystack of thousands of similar trucks. By 2024, 30 years had passed. The parents of the Oakhaven 6 were in their late 60s and 70s. Some had already passed away, taking their grief to the grave. The case had transitioned from an active manhunt into local folklore, the subject of podcasts and internet speculation. The silence of Blackwood Ridge seemed absolute. It was a place that kept its secrets well. But the earth keeps what it takes only for a while. Eventually, the ground shifts, and the secrets buried in the dark begin to rise. Act 3. The Resurrection. The resolution of cold cases rarely comes from a sudden confession. It usually comes from a collision of modern technology and unrelated environmental changes. For the Oakhaven 6, that collision occurred in the fall of 2024. The Blackwood Quarry, located roughly 3 miles from where the van was found, had been decommissioned and flooded since the late 1980s. For decades, it was a stagnant, massive lake of toxic, mineral-heavy water. However, in early 2024, a major corporate land buyout occurred. A lithium processing corporation purchased the land and began the massive, multi-month logistical operation of draining the main pit to access the limestone bedrock below. By October 2024, the water levels had dropped by nearly 80 feet, exposing sections of the quarry walls that had not seen sunlight in 40 years. On October 12, an engineering crew assessing the stability of the drained rock face noticed an anomaly. Built into the side of the sheer limestone wall, previously submerged under 50 feet of murky water, was a man-made access tunnel. This was not unusual for a quarry. What was unusual was the entrance. The tunnel was sealed by a massive, rusted iron grate, and securing that grate was a heavy-duty, commercial-grade steel padlock, heavily corroded by decades underwater. Furthermore, the gate had been reinforced with a thick layer of industrial concrete, poured directly over the hinges to ensure it could never be opened. Curiosity prompted the engineers to break the seal. Utilizing heavy hydraulic cutters, they breached the gate and walked into the dark, damp, subterranean shaft. 50 feet into the tunnel, the engineers stopped. They immediately turned around, exited the shaft, and called the state police. Inside the tunnel, preserved in the cold, anaerobic, oxygen-deprived environment of the flooded mine, were the skeletal remains of 6 individuals. The recovery operation was treated as an archaeological excavation. Forensic anthropologists from the State Bureau established a secure perimeter. The meticulous sifting of the tunnel floor yielded a heartbreaking collection of artifacts. A silver locket, a rusted class ring, remnants of formal wear, a shredded piece of emerald green fabric, a decayed tuxedo cummerbund, and, critically, the wallet of David Vance, his driver's license still legible beneath the silt. The Oakhaven 6 had finally been found. With the recovery of the victims, the investigation transitioned back into an active homicide inquiry. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner. The trauma analysis provided a grim, terrifying timeline of their final moments. The cause of death was not drowning. The water had flooded the tunnel years after they were sealed inside due to rising water tables. The remains showed evidence of severe blunt force trauma. Skulls and ribs fractured by a heavy, cylindrical weapon, likely a steel pipe or a lug wrench. Several of the victims exhibited defensive wounds on their forearms. The forensic evidence suggested a horrific, desperate struggle in the dark. But the breakthrough that would finally close the case did not come from the bones. It came from the lock. Investigators recovered the commercial-grade steel padlock that had secured the iron grate. Despite the corrosion, metallurgical specialists at the FBI laboratory used acid etching techniques to reveal a stamped serial number on the base of the lock. This was not a padlock bought at a local hardware store. It was a specialized, high-security lock manufactured by a specific industrial supply company. Detectives subpoenaed the company's archival sales records from the early 1990s. The records showed that a batch of 50 of these specific locks was sold in 1992 to the Blackwood Mining Corporation, the company that originally owned the quarry before it went bankrupt. Detectives pulled the employee manifests for the Blackwood Mining Corporation from 1994. They cross-referenced the employee list with individuals who had access to utility vehicles, specifically Ford F-350 trucks, and individuals who possessed keys to the subterranean access tunnels. One name glowed like a beacon in the files: Arthur Vance. No relation to the victim, David Vance. In 1994, Arthur Vance was 38 years old. He was the head of site security and maintenance for the quarry. He drove a company-issued 1988 Ford F-350 utility truck outfitted with a heavy brush guard. He held the master keys to every lock on the property. Furthermore, his personnel file indicated he had access to the industrial concrete used to reinforce the mine shafts. Vance had a documented history of volatile, territorial behavior. He had numerous complaints filed against him by local teenagers for aggressively running them off the quarry access roads, occasionally brandishing a firearm. The narrative finally snapped into devastating focus. On the night of May 14, 1994, the six friends drove up to Miller's Bluff. For reasons unknown, they took a wrong turn, or decided to explore the dark, winding logging roads near the quarry. At 3:14 a.m., Kevin O'Connor attempted to call for help from a payphone, likely after Vance began pursuing them in his utility truck. Vance intercepted the van on the isolated road, using his truck to block their path, the exact scene captured in the blurry photograph. Armed and aggressive, he forced the teenagers out of the van. The specifics of the ensuing altercation are a secret taken to the grave by those involved, but the forensic evidence proves it escalated into horrific violence. Utilizing his intimate knowledge of the quarry, Vance transported the victims, either deceased or incapacitated, to the access tunnel. He locked the iron grate with a company padlock and, to ensure his crime would never be discovered, he poured concrete over the hinges. He then abandoned their van a few miles away, leaving the doors open to stage a confusing scene. In January 2025, a heavily armed strike team of state police and FBI agents arrived at a modest, single-story home in a neighboring state. They knocked on the door and arrested Arthur Vance. He was 69 years old, a frail man living a quiet, unassuming life, surrounded by neighbors who thought he was just a grumpy retiree. Faced with the overwhelming, irrefutable weight of the forensic evidence, the padlock serial numbers, and the geographical profiling, Vance's defense collapsed. In late 2025, to avoid the death penalty, Arthur Vance pleaded guilty to 6 counts of aggravated murder. He offered no detailed confession, no tearful apology, and no explanation for his rage. He simply answered guilty 6 times in a quiet, hollow courtroom. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. For the surviving family members of the Oakhaven Six, the sentencing was a moment of profound, conflicting emotion. The nightmare of the unknown was finally over. The monster had a name, and he was in a cage. They were finally able to bring their children home, laying them to rest in a sunlit cemetery overlooking the town they loved. Yet, the resolution of a 30-year cold case is never truly a victory. The ledger of justice cannot balance the loss of 6 vibrant lives, nor can it return the decades of paralyzing grief suffered by their parents. We know who blocked the road that night, and we know the horrific lengths he went to hide his sins. But the exact sequence of events, the terror of those final moments, and the senseless, terrifying rationale behind the violence remain locked away in the mind of a murderer. Some answers come too late, and some questions are never fully answered.